In this video, we'll review the structure and circuitry of the basal ganglia. I want to start with the 3D animation of my basal ganglia from a 7 Tesla MRI in my brain, in which the structure of the basal ganglia were segmented. So you can see in green is the caudate. This is this sort of tadpole-shaped structure which has a head, a body, and a tail. In blue is the putamen, which is sort of more egg-shaped or football-shaped. These are bilateral structures. Together, the putamen and the caudate are called the striatum. Now, medial to the putamen here, in this sort of yellow-orangish color, is the globus pallidus. There's a globus pallidus internal and a globus pallidus external. Now, I've drawn those structures in this outline, and you can follow along and draw with me here. And so we have the striatum, the caudate and the putamen together here in the middle. We also have two portions of the globus pallidus. There's an external here that's part of the indirect pathway, and an internal here that's part of both pathways. What I didn't show you in the previous animation was the thalamus, which has a nucleus called the VAVL, the ventral anterior ventral lateral. That is the motor sort of gas pedal, the motor component that interacts with both the direct and the indirect pathway. Also, there's other structures, the substantia nigra pars compacta, which is S and C, that plays a role in both the direct and indirect pathway of the basal ganglia. It is located in the midbrain. It produces dopamine, and it sends that dopamine to the striatum, where it will synapse onto either D1 or D2 receptors. Finally, there is the STN, which stands for the subthalamic nucleus, and that's located sub or beneath the thalamus. So what I want to do now is walk through the pathways step by step. Follow along, and please draw these arrows with me. It'll help you follow along in the lecture this week. So the first thing I do, I always start at the bottom with the thalamus, right? The thalamus is the gas pedal. Glutamate gas pedal on. Glutamate gas pedal on. And so the thalamus excites or produces movement through the motor cortex. It's been said that the basal ganglia is sort of the gateway for movement, right? The motor cortex is the command that tells muscles to contract through the corticospinal pathway and the cortical bulbar pathways. But the basal ganglia is the gateway. And so the thalamus you can think of as like the gas pedal is on, but we don't want movement to be on all the time. And so there's a parking brake. And the parking brake is the GPI and the globus pallidus internal and the SNR, which is the substantia nigra pars reticulata. In both the direct and the indirect pathway, these release GABA, sort of like a parking brake inhibiting movement, right? So you've got the gas pedal on, but the parking brake on also. Why would you design a system like this? Well, think about it. What's faster? Drag racers know this. They put the gas on and the parking brake on, and the fastest way to accelerate is to release the parking brake. That's a lot faster than starting from scratch with your foot on the floor, having to lift your foot, get it on the pedal, and accelerate. Right? So this actually makes quite a lot of sense. It's pretty neat. What does the striatum do? In the direct pathway, the striatum sends axons to the GPI that are inhibitory. They release GABA, so they are inhibiting the parking brake. So this is like the hand being lifted, lifted off of, or releasing the parking brake, right? We're taking the parking brake off because we're inhibiting the parking brake. 2 inhibitory circuits in a row is the same as 1 excitatory circuit that cancel out. So the motor cortex releases glutamate, and I'm kind of combining motor cortex with other parts of the cortex, including premotor cortex and supplementary motor area. They're releasing glutamate to excite the striatum. And so what you end up having in the direct pathway is an excitation or of movement in this loop. Now, what happens in the indirect pathway? Well, a lot of the same exact things, right? The gas pedal's on, the parking brake is on, right? So we're inhibiting movement, but then you have this indirect pathway shown as follow. STN excites with glutamate the GPI. The GPE inhibits GABA, right? And then we have you are inhibiting the thing that's inhibiting an inhibitory, right? You have to really count up the minuses. So the net output of the indirect pathway is inhibition. So let's put this into a chart. Here's the basal ganglia without the substantia nigra. We're not even taking into consideration dopamine right now. The direct pathway default is excitation to the cortex, and the indirect pathway is inhibition. Because you end up in this indirect pathway ultimately with the parking brake on. Now, what happens when you add dopamine through the substantia nigra, right? So in the direct pathway, what substantia nigra pars compacta does is it releases dopamine that binds to D1 receptors. This is excitatory, and it leads to more excitation. So you're just enhancing what's already happening, which is to take the hand off the parking brake and allow the gateway of movement to open. What we're doing in the indirect pathway with dopamine being released and binding to D2 receptors is the opposite. So I am inhibiting the indirect pathway, which is a gateway closed or off or inhibition of movement. If I am inhibiting that, then ultimately what dopamine does to the indirect pathway is allow excitation to occur. A couple of points I want to make here. One, the D1 and D2 receptors are located on the striatum, and they both, dopamine in both cases leads to excitation of cortex. Now, when you lose dopamine, as in the case of Parkinson's disease with degeneration of neurons in the substantia nigra pars compacta, you're losing dopamine. And so while there's still an excitation of movement in the direct pathway, this indirect pathway is gateway closed. This is why patients tend to have difficulty initiating movement and have other symptoms, including slowness of movement, bradykinesia. In another disease of the basal ganglia, the Huntington's disease, what happens is the neurons in the striatum degenerate. So that means we're losing a population of neurons in the striatum that are trying to inhibit the GPE. These are the D2 receptor cell bodies that send axons. So you need to think about it as actually you're losing this GABA arrow right here in Huntington's disease, and that leads to increased movement, hyperkinetic movements, movements that are that pass the gate when they shouldn't, right? We'll talk more about this in the lab and in lecture.